Really good news for Ukraine. Following the G7 summit in France, Donald Trump agreed to provide assistance to Ukraine, including supplying missiles, as well as increasing pressure on Putin, including strengthening sanctions. But in exchange, he wants help from his allies in Europe regarding Iran, since his peace agreement looks more like a failure in Iran than a victory. And more importantly, the outlines of a deal between the US and Europe in which Trump backs Europe on Ukraine, and Europe helps him ensure the Hormuz Strait is actually open in the Middle East, have finally taken shape, and now it has become clear what Donald Trump wanted from Europe. Europe felt that Trump needed it and put forward a counter-demand, help with Iran in exchange for help on the issue of Russia's war against Ukraine. And Trump signed this deal. And most importantly, after the summit, Trump supported the joint G7 Communiqué, which clearly states not only support for Ukraine and a sharp increase in pressure on Russia, it also says that Ukraine will, after all, receive licenses to produce Western missiles and air defense systems in Ukraine. And after the summit, Trump himself publicly stated that yes, the US will consider providing long-range missiles to Ukraine, and will also help Ukraine to force the bold dictator Vladimir Putin to sit at the negotiating table. My name is Alexei Pechii. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel, like this episode, and don't forget to leave your comment under this video. And subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechii News. The link to it is in the description of this video. So let's go through everything step by step. After criticizing his European allies, Trump suddenly started praising the G7 summit in France, and even Emmanuel Macron personally for organizing it, even though before the trip he had threatened new tariffs. But in the end, Politico writes the following, quote, Trump is clearly open to increasing pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin to end his war against Ukraine, as well as his own need for help from allies to stabilize the framework agreement on a ceasefire with Iran. The outlines of a deal in which Trump supports Europe regarding Ukraine in exchange for European assistance to secure the Strait of Hormuz, the main waterway, whose closure during a war with Iran led to a sharp rise in energy prices, seem to be taking shape. The discussions we have had among ourselves and with the President of the United States, both at official meetings and informal gatherings in the country, give me a certain sense of optimism, said German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. A sense of relief was palpable among all the diplomats and officials who spoke with the politician. So, at this stage, Europe has clearly taken the initiative in organizing negotiations with the Russians about peace in Ukraine, and Europe is actively increasing its support for Ukraine and pressure on Russia through sanctions. But US assistance is still needed here, obviously, while Trump needs the help of Europeans in implementing and upholding the agreement that the US and Iran will sign on Friday. And finally, tough pragmatism has started to prevail. But until the very end, Europe still feared that Trump would ruin everything. Well, while he was fighting with Iran, Europe had already built a clear scheme for putting pressure on Putin. Ukraine had significantly increased the number of long-range strikes on Russia, and everyone was satisfied, except for Putin, of course. And in Europe, they were afraid that now Trump would come and ruin everything with his calls to make concessions to Vladimir Putin. The fact that Trump had an almost hour-long phone conversation with Putin on Sunday only heightened these concerns, hinting that he might return to pressuring Ukraine to give up territory and accept this uneven deal. But after Trump spoke for more than an hour, by the way, with Zelensky and other European leaders at the G7 summit, he suddenly came out and announced with a smile on his face that the US would reimpose sanctions on the oil and gas sector. And he immediately added that it is Russia that should finally make the deal. Moreover, just today he stated directly, and I quote, "We will consider the possibility of supplying American missiles to Ukraine." And he said that the talks with Putin and Zelensky went very well. But he says Ukraine needs help, and we will definitely provide that help. But it's obvious that such willingness from Donald Trump, of course, comes with its own price, which is why I mentioned pragmatism a bit earlier. It became known that Trump agreed to put pressure on Vladimir Putin and help Ukraine, but in return he demanded that the Europeans support his deal with Iran and help with demining the Strait of Hormuz. The Europeans agreed to help if Trump would assist with Ukraine. As a result, everyone benefits, and that's why Trump leaves the summit looking so pleased and smiling. By the way, Macron pulled off a cool trick here. And in order to avoid a repeat of last year's G7 summit, which, let me remind you, Trump left early saying he had nothing more to do there, Macron convinced Trump to extend his stay by inviting him to a dinner at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris. And knowing how much Trump loves this kind of exclusivity, it worked. And next they will quote Trump himself. You know, I was supposed to leave on Tuesday afternoon, and then the president of France, who turns out to be a really good guy, invited me to dinner at Versailles. And you know, Versailles isn't just surface gilding, it's a real treasure. So in the end, Trump stayed at the summit for another day. And as a result of the summit, the G7 leaders issued a statement on Ukraine, and importantly, Donald Trump signed it. The main points outlined there are as follows. Unwavering support for Ukraine in defending its freedom, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. A high appreciation for Ukraine's resilience and its successes on the battlefield in recent months highlights new momentum. It means that Ukraine has taken the initiative. An agreement to increase the supply of air defense systems and long-range strike capabilities. Willingness to consider granting Ukraine a license to expand its military production. There will be a separate episode on this topic on this YouTube channel coming out today, so I recommend you subscribe to the channel because this is a super important topic. To put it very briefly, the US and Europe are giving Ukrainian manufacturers their licenses to produce advanced missiles, air defense systems, and so on. Looking ahead, I'll give you a spoiler for the next episode. This includes Patriot interceptor missiles. And here's an interesting scheme. The Americans give a license to the Europeans, and the Europeans formally open production in Ukraine. But this production is then carried out specifically by Ukrainian specialists. In general, that's a separate topic, and it's super important. And what else is in the G7 Communiqué, an agreement to provide further support so that Ukraine can get through next winter? And a commitment to increase pressure on the Russian military economy to strengthen sanctions, including those against the oil and gas sector. And Trump agreed with this as well. Well, if things keep going this way, we have to admit, Europe has not only managed to wake up, but also to seize the initiative. And finally, let's say to be a leader rather than a follower in relations with the US. I'll leave it at that for now. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so with any donation using the links and details in the description of this video. There you'll find Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, even crypto wallets, bank details, and YouTube membership. Choose any format that's convenient for you. I will be grateful for any support you give. That's it for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.